Welcome to Chapter 10, Cognitive Behavior Therapy. This is one of the most clinically important chapters in the course. CBT is not a single approach, it is a family of related approaches sharing key assumptions about the role of thinking in emotional and behavioral problems. You'll encounter four major figures in this chapter. To name them, Albert Ellis, Aaron Beck, Christine Petesky, and Donald Meichenbaum. Each has made a distinct contribution, and together they have built the most empirically valid tradition in psychotherapy. As you work through this material, I want you to hold one orienting question. How does the way I think about a situation shape how I feel and what I do? This question is the beating heart of every approach in this chapter. So let's begin. Before we look at each approach individually, let's establish what all cognitive behavior approaches share, because this common foundation is as important as the differences. All CBT approaches rest on a collaborative therapeutic relationship, pretty much like similar to different theories we spoke. The therapist and client are partners in the work, not expert and patient, not teacher and passive student, but active co investigators. Both bring knowledge. The therapist brings theory and technique, the client brings lived experience and self knowledge. All share the premise that psychological distress is largely maintained by cognitive processes, meaning that how we interpret and think about events have more to do with our suffering than the events themselves. This is not a claim that thought is the only cause of distress or the real world problem doesn't matter. It's a claim that our interpretations, beliefs, and self statements are so powerful in the liver of in as a liver of this change. All aim to change conditions, thoughts, beliefs, assumptions, and core schemas as the primary path to changing emotions and behavior. This is a direct this is a direction of causation claim that distinguished CBT from behavioral therapy, which target behavior directly or maintaining conditions, if you remember, and from psychodynamics, which targets relational patterns and historical insights. So, all are present centered and time limited. CBT is not open ended exploration, it is a structured, goal directed, and focused on what is happening now, and all involved in active, directive therapist who function as teacher, guide, and collaborator, not as a blank screen. Now you can see in the second wave of behavior therapy, C was added, cognitive aspect, what cognition was added, and that's what you see. The primary focus will be the cognitive processes. To keep it short, Albert Ellis developed ERBT, which stands for Emotion, Rational, REBT, Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy, in 1950s, making him the well-known person in cognitive behavioral tradition. Ellis has been trained as a psychoanalyst, but found that approach too passive and too slow. That's why he developed REBT, a direct active educational approach to change the belief systems that he believed at the root of emotional disturbances. REBT is grounded in similar but powerful premises. It is not the events in our life that disturb us, it is our beliefs about those events. Alice drew on the Socratic philosopher, Stoic philosopher Epicurus, who wrote the person are disturbed not by things, but by their opinion about things. The ancient insight is the cornerstone of REBT. Now, if you look at an example, REBT has this ABC framework, right? If you remember, this is not the behavior ABC model. This one is REBT ABC framework. Actually, there is D and E as well later. So A stands for activating event, something that happens in the world or in your mind. And behavior is itself, behavior will come back, but the C stands for the consequence, right? Your emotional or behavioral reactions. Now, the common assumption is that A causes C, right? What happened in the world causes some kind of consequences. That is not the case. In REBT, they insist that B, which stands for belief about your A, the activating event, is what actually causes C. So if I were to do that, A is influenced by B. A influenced B, and that lead to the consequence. So let's say you got a speeding ticket. If your belief about speeding ticket is that you are a failure, you don't follow rules, you don't know how to drive, if that is the belief system, the consequence would be a lot of distress, right? It's a very simple, again, random example. Now, another person who was driving also got a ticket, but their belief system is, I was not paying attention, so I missed the speed limit, and hence I got a speeding ticket. Consequence is temporary discomfort, temporary dissatisfaction. You pay the due, moving forward, you may not even bothered by that event. However, person one, let's call the person one, who believed that getting a speeding ticket is a major personal failure, if that is the belief, that could lead to more suffering, more psychological distress than the person two. Now that's what Albert Ellis talks about, your irrational belief, the B, right? Now, if you think of, I must be thoroughly competent in everything I do, if that is the belief system, right? And that's an irrational belief, because the common assumption again is that when A happens, you make a mistake, right? You're driving, you made a mistake, you're supposed to be thoroughly competent in everything you do. Now your belief system kicks in, and you must be competent in everything, including driving. That generates the consequence of feeling shame, depression, self condemnation. So, where does that come from? Well, that is the B, right? The belief system about yourself affected you. So B is changed to a rational preference. So what we try to do in REBT is, instead of having strong rules, you try to make a more general, more feasible rules. Like, I'd prefer to do well, but I'm a fallible human and make mistakes are part of learning. What you did with the B is you changed from I should be competent in everything I do to I'm a fallible person. If anything happens, I'll learn from it moving forward. Now, same event repeats. You got a ticket. You may not feel as strong shame as earlier. You might feel disappointed. You might feel a little not happy about what happened, but you move on. In the case scenario in Stan, you will see some similar examples, right? So I want you to take a look at them as well. So RABD holds that humans have a strong tendency to transform preference into demands, right? If you look at some of the statement, if you write, when I teach this in class, I ask students to write down what are some of the statement that you tell yourself a lot, and you often end with strong terms like I must, I should, I have to, I'm ought to. Those are statements, right? Those are very strong rule-bound statements, and Alice is very clever to come up with like terms. Masturbation. It's not masturbation, which is different, but masturbation is like there is like a lot of must and should statement. Those are rule bound, and those beliefs tend to make people rigid, inflexible. And our job is to, I said about D and E, you have to dispute your belief. I must be competent in everything I do must be challenged. You have to dispute. Well, I'm fallible. I may make mistake. So what? That doesn't make me less competent. I can learn from a mistake. That is the disputing, right? You're trying to challenge, how often you fail when you drive. You drive every day. Do you get ticket every day? So it's kind of disputing your belief and now come up with the effective thinking process, effective cognitive process, belief system, which is I'm a fallible person. So that's how you see REBT works, and there's a lot more. Again, this is the introductory part. That's why we try to identify, what these REBT different techniques use to help people to change their belief system. Now, let's take a little closer look at REBT, right? And you will see REBT view of how emotional disturbance develop and is maintained because it is where the clinical work begins. Alice argued that although the original seeds of emotional disturbance are planted in childhood, through messages from parents, culture, and experience. If you remember Freud's idea, superego, right? People don't simply suffer from what happened to them. They actively maintain their disturbances by continuing to tell themselves irrational and self-defeating things. Disturbances is not something done to us in the past, it is something we do to ourselves in the present, moment by moment, through our self talk. Now, if you take a pause and you must be talking to yourself now, that's what self talk, it's very implicit, it's very covert. We don't say out loud like children. So we constantly talk to ourselves. And this is simultaneously a radical and a hopeful claim. Radical because it asks clients to take responsibilities for their own emotional lives in a deep way, not by blaming themselves, but by recognizing their own agency. Hopeful because it makes change is possible. If we are generating our own disturbances through what we tell ourselves, we can learn to tell ourselves something different. The main categories of irrational beliefs involved, that's how you see that irrational belief involves awfulizing, right? That means you kind of see problem in a disproportionate way, catastrophizing, right? Low frustration tolerance. Sometimes people don't do what you ask, what you expect. Now you have this, I can't stand it. I can't stand so and so. So that is like a low frustration tolerance, right? So I mentioned about awfulizing, low frustration tolerance, right? And also demanding, which is the masturbation version, right? I must do it. I should be doing it. The world must be a good place. Everybody must be respectful. And that is the third one, right? Must and should rules you have. And the last one is self and other rating, constantly rating others. So awfulizing, low frustration tolerance, must and should, demanding statements. Yeah, you see here must, ought, should, right? And the fourth one is um, self and other rating. We constantly rate ourselves compared to others. These four patterns appear repeatedly across clients and problems. And what REBT tries to do is REBT targets unconditional self acceptance as a core therapeutic goal. Now, if you think of an example, how you criticize yourself, how quickly you lose patience, how strong demands you have about yourself, and how you compare to others, in the core there is self, right? It's about you, it's about yourself, what you tell yourself. Now the job is, how do we accept ourselves without any condition, no matter how good you are, no matter how where you fall in any category. So the job is to accepting unconditionally. Now, not conditional self-acceptance. Again, no, I must, okay, I'm okay if I succeed. Now that's conditional versus unconditional. I accept myself as fallible human being regardless of my performance. That is unconditional acceptance. This extends to unconditional other acceptance and unconditional life acceptance. So those are acceptance of self, acceptance of other, and life in a broader sense. You are accepting those events without any condition. Accepting the life is often difficult and unfair without demanding it to otherwise. So if you look at REBT, there is a worksheet, there's an activity I normally do, but I can tell you there's an A, B, C, D, E worksheet where client identifies their activating event, right? If you go back, there's an activating event, there is your irrational belief. You have certain belief about yourself, whether it is awfulizing, low frustration tolerance, and so on. And there's a consequence, how it makes you feel, right? The consequence. And you try to dispute, not B, D. You try to dispute that irrational belief. Let's say you, again, going back to a speeding ticket, you got a speeding ticket, you have to dispute that irrational belief that I must be competent in everything I do. So you can challenge the belief system. There are many, getting one speeding ticket does not make me a bad driver, or getting one speeding ticket does not make me an incompetent person. So at least that will change to feel that less emotional distress. And I want you to think of like, how do we change to the effective thinking process, which would be, you know, people get ticket when they are not mindful. Next time I can pay attention to the road sign, so I am mindful about my driving. So you change your belief system. You change yourself, I'm fallible and I'm learning from my mistakes. So I want you to think about other examples, how you can change your belief system by disputing them. Similar thing happens in cognitive therapy. We'll see in a bit. And here, there are some therapeutic goals, RBT, that therapeutic goals and the therapeutic process are deeply intertwined because Alice argued that therapy is fundamentally a process of re-education. The primary goal is to help clients identify and uproot their self-defeating beliefs and replace them with a more rational, tolerant, and compassionate philosophy of life. This involves learning to distinguish between realistic and unrealistic goals and self defeating and self enhancing ways of pursuing them, right? Now, think of this idea like a philosophy. Alice was not just targeting specific thoughts, he was aiming at a fundamental reorganization of clients' operating system. Not merely I'll challenge the thought that I fail at this task, but I'll adopt a new way of relating to failure, fallibility, and frustration as part of human condition. Now, the therapeutic relationship in REBT is notably different from client centered or relational approaches. Alice did not believe that a warm, deeply personal relationship was necessary or sufficient for change. What was essential, he argued, was unconditional positive regard, which you heard from client centered therapy. The therapist's unconditional acceptance of the client as a person, even while vigorously challenging their irrational beliefs. It's a tricky place to be. You cannot accept them and also then challenge them. It's a hard job to do. It takes quite a bit of practice. The therapist does not condemn the client. That's not what we're doing. The therapist teaches the client how to stop condemning themselves. This means the RBT therapist is highly active, directive, and sometimes confrontational. Alice himself was famous for his rapid fire, provocative style. You can YouTube and find Alice's interviews with his clients. He would directly challenge clients' irrational beliefs within the first session, dispute their logic, and assign homework immediately. The style worked with many clients and alienated others. Of course, you can think about it. Contemporary RBT practitioners tend to use the same conceptual framework with considerably more warmth and flexibility. If you think of how you can use this irrational belief, I want to invite you to read through some of the examples in the text and see if you can identify the patterns. And again, this is not a clinical exercise; it's a personal one. Knowing your own irrational belief is part of becoming a competent cognitive behavior therapist, right? If you see unconditional self-acceptance, unconditional other acceptance, unconditional life acceptance. Now, these are the process, and that's what you're trying to do by using directive and confrontational approach in REBT. Now, what kind of cognitive techniques are there? REBT uses an integrated self set of cognitive, emotive, and behavioral techniques, and this multi-model approach is one of its genuine strengths. On the cognitive side, the primary tool is disputing irrational belief, as you see, right? Systematically challenging the evidence, and the utility of irrational belief. Now, the disputing question are the engine of REBT. And this belief consistent with is this belief that somebody has a belief, I must be driving so safe every time I go, which is a good one. But if you think if I failed in one task, I'm incompetent. Let's say that. That is a belief. Now you want to challenge, is this belief consistent with reality? Is that the case for everybody? Is it logical? Is human free from fallibility? Does it help me or hurt me? If I have belief like this, how do I complete any task? How do I learn any new skill? Is it really an awful is it really as awful as I'm making it? Failing one task, not completing one task perfectly, does that make me feel an awful person? Can I stand it? Now I'm reversing, right? You're thinking about the um, awfulizing, low frustration tolerance, demanding, and the last one was comparing, right? So if you think of these, how when you challenge these disputing irrational belief, these are the irrational belief, you're trying to challenge them. That's what I'm giving example here. I don't like it, but I can stand it. So trying to change from I must to I prefer. It's awful to it's unfortunate. So it's a shift in language, right? The linguistic substitution are not mere positive thinking, they reflect a genuinely different philosophical stance toward difficulty and frustration. On the emotive side, the cognitive side, now we think of the emotive side. Rational emotive imagery asks client to vivid imagine a distressing situation, allow themselves to feel the unhealthy negative emotions, anxiety, depression, rage, and then practice shifting that emotion to a healthy negative alternative, concern, sadness, and annoyance, not by changing the imaged event, but by changing their belief about it. This is a powerful technique for practicing emotional change in imagination before applying it in real life. And shame attacking exercise are another one you might have heard in this chapter. Shame attacking exercises are characteristically Alice's idea. Clients deliberately do something they feel embarrassing. Sing in public, wear an odd outfit, tell a stranger a joke they're sure that will fall flat, right? To prove to themselves that they can be foolishly they can act foolishly without the world ending and without their self worth collapsing. The goal is to decondition the shame response and build tolerance for social discomfort. I know, I'm sure you might be thinking, like, oh, I'm not going to do this. But the idea is, how do we disprove our belief? How do you dispute our belief if we don't test, if we don't examine in real examples? That's where there's a shame attacking exercise sometimes seems to be helpful for people to feel less embarrassed, mostly the imagined embarrassment. Behavioral techniques include operational conditioning, for example, self management, modeling, and homework across all three domains. Cognitive emotional behavior is a consistent feature in REBT. Now, let's talk about Aaron Beck briefly. Aaron Beck developed cognitive therapy in 1960s, initially as a treatment for depression. Beck was trained as a psychoanalyst, and when he examined his depressed patient with depression, their thinking patterns carefully, he noticed something consistent. They had a systemic negative bias in how they interpret events about themselves, the world, and the future. He called this the negative cognitive triad, right? About themselves, others, and the future. Beck Cognitive Therapy shares what REBT is focused on changing cognitions, but the style is quite different. Analysis, confrontation, and directive, Beck is using Socratic and collaborative approach. Rather than telling clients their beliefs are irrational, Beck invites clients to examine the evidence from their beliefs themselves through a process he called collaborative empiricism. The client and therapists are like two scientists jointly investigating the evidence for and against the client's conclusion. Right? You try to think of like a pros and cons, evidence for and against. You have this conversation with your client. The three theoretical assumptions distinguish Beck's cognitive therapy. First, uh, people's thought process are accessible to introspection. We can notice and examine our own thoughts. So our thoughts are accessible. Second, our beliefs have highly personal meanings that need to be understood in context. So thoughts are accessible to us and personal meaning, right? Yeah, it's here. Yeah, we can access the thought. We can find this personal meaning. Um, The third, people can discover their own cognitive errors rather than being told about them. And that self discovery is more therapeutically powerful than any account of therapist instruction. The third assumption is the key difference from REBT practice. Beck used guided discovery, Socratic questioning that leads the client to arrive at the corrected belief through their own reasoning. On the other hand, Alice disputes, Beck guides discovery, right? So if you think of helping people find their own discovery versus like disputing, then it's slightly different. And the negative cognitive triad in depression illustrates that the model beautifully. If you think of a client who is depressed hold negative view of self. I'm worthless, I'm defective, I'm unlovable, the world is harsh, demanding, full of obstacles, there is nothing that will ever happen good to me, I am hopeless. Now these elements mutually reinforce each other, creating a self confirming system of despair. Cognitive therapy identifies these patterns, constructs them as testable hypotheses, and collaboratively gathers evidence to test them. Think of the example in the Corey's book, Ruth. Ruth tells herself, I must be perfect at everything. This is not just a thought, it's a schema, a deep organizing belief that shapes her experience across situation. Cognitive behavior therapy helps identify their belief, trace its consequences, and construct an alternative. I value doing things well, but my worth is not contingent upon my performance. So you try to do something similar to disputing, but rather than asking, the same like, I must be perfect at everything, and you'd look for evidence for and against how many times you have done things that is perfect, how many times you have done that is imperfect. So you're gathering evidence, right, and trying to adjust or have this alternative belief about self. And there's more. So let's see what happens. Now, Beck identified seven specific cognitive distortions, systemic errors in thinking that create and maintain psychological distress. These are worth knowing in detail because you'll recognize them immediately in clients and probably in yourself as well. The first one is arbitrary inference, drawing a conclusion without sufficient supporting evidence. A client whose friend didn't call back concludes she doesn't like me anymore without any evidence. That happens all over the time, right? Selective abstraction, focusing on one negative detail while ignoring the broad context. A student gets feedback on a paper, 15 positive comments and 2 criticism. What do you think they are fixated on now? Of course, those 2 criticism. There was a 20 points in assignment, you got 19, lost 1 point. Are you happy about 19 points? Probably not. You might be so fixated on losing 1 point. So that's a selective abstraction. Think of the life event as well. Overgeneralization. Overgeneralization, applying a conclusion from one event to all situations. I failed this test, therefore I always fail. I'm a failure as a person. Magnification and minimization, blowing negative out of proportion or shrinking positives. The classic making mountain out of molehills while simultaneously dismissing genuine strengths and success as nothing special. Personalization, relating external events to oneself without basis. It rained on my picnic. I should have known something would go wrong for me. That's again, it has a little to do with who you are when there's a rain. Labeling and mislabeling, defining one's identity based on a single error or characteristics. I forget to turn in the form. I am irresponsible. I am a failure. The behavior becomes fused with the self, right? And dichotomous thinking, seeing situations in absolute either or the term. If I'm not perfect, I'm complete failure. No middle ground or no nuances, right? If you think of a person who is 16-year-old, is actually an example in my note, who is biracial adolescents navigating a disorienting and school transition. As you see, Dr. Bailey identifies all or nothing thinking. None of my peers will ever accept me, and jumping to conclusion, predicting total rejection without evidence. And what you do, teach Brittany to identify and label her distortions, then examine the actual evidence. Brittany comes to recognize she has no crystal ball and that social rejections was not guaranteed. This didactic experience process is what we try to do in CBT and how it works. Okay, a little bit more about some other individuals like Christina and Kathleen. They talk about strength-based cognitive behavior therapy representing a significant and generative expansion of Beck's model. While traditional CBT focus on primarily on identifying and correcting what is wrong, faulty beliefs, cognitive distortions, and maladaptive behaviors, right? You look at the strength-based CBT, ask a different question. What is already working? What strengths, resources, and positive qualities can be identified and harnessed? The fundamental premise is that active incorporation of client strengths encourages deeper engagement with therapy and often opens pathway for changing the problem focused approaches that often miss, right? This has roots in positive psychology, which investigates not just dysfunction, but well being, resilience, creativity, and flourishing. SBCBT operates through four steps, as you can see in the textbook as well. So, what do? Search, right? Actively look for client strengths and areas of life that are going well. Number two, construct. Use those strengths as a model for how client would live to be in difficult areas. Apply. Test how the identified strengths can be applied to changing situation. And practice. Rehearse the new strength-based way of being until it becomes habitual. Right? If you think of any other situation, people those who are anxious, people those who are constantly avoiding because of anxiety disorders, you might want to look for what they have as a strength. Perhaps they are good at organizing, perhaps they are good at keeping contact with family and friends, right? So once you have search something, you construct, you try to identify how to use this as a model for new behavior, and then apply and practice. So it's pretty straightforward if you think of those four steps. One important distinction that the therapist in SBCBT does not take an expert stance. Instead, they serve as a curious assistant or guide to the client's own discovery. This aligns closely with person centered values. The client is the expert on their own experience, strengths, and what a better life would look like. SB CBT has three application formats as an add on to classic CBT, right? If you think of identifying strengths to mobilize alongside traditional CBT structuring as a four-step resilience building model and a new paradigm approach for chronic difficulties and personal disorder, where constructing a new way of functioning is often more effective than trying to repair an entrenched old pattern. So the clinical application is significant. If you're working with a client who has failed repeatedly at conventional CBT techniques, SBCBT offers a different entry point through what they do well already rather than what they have been unable to change. And Donald contributed to CBT on the concept of self-talk. We might do this all the time, the internal dialogue that runs continuously in our minds, in the stories we construct about ourselves and our experiences. His approach, cognitive behavioral modification, holds that distressing emotions are largely the product of maladaptive self-statements, and that change happens when clients learn to interpret those patterns and replace them with more adaptive coping self-talk. Donald's model of behavioral change involves three phases. First, self-observation. Clients learn to notice and monitor their own thinking, feeling, behaving, and to observe the impact they have on others. Without this awareness, change is impossible. So first part is self-observation, right? Second, starting a new internal dialogue. Now, internal dialogue, again, I mentioned we all start talking to ourselves when we have language. If you observe young kids under 4, they constantly talk, but they're talking to themselves. That used to be very overt. As we grow older, that external speaking now become internal dialogue. We don't speak out loud. Piaget studied, many Noam Chomsky, those all linguists and the child development individuals studied about this, and it's very important skill for self-regulation. So clients begins to substitute that new internal dialogue, which is constructive and coping self-statement for negative self-defeating ones. Not, I can't do this, I'm going to fail, but this is challenging. I can use the strategies I have picked practice. Third, acquiring new skills. Client practice these coping behaviors, but in session and in real life situation until they become fluent. Now, another part here is stress inoculation training is another powerful influence by Donald, right? That is a flagship application. The name is deliberately biological, just as a vaccine introduces a mild form of pathogen to build immunity. SIT, stress inoculation training, exposes client to mild stress in a controlled, supported environment. So they develop tolerance and coping capacity before facing stronger stressors. SIT has three phases again: the conceptual education phase, understanding how stress and one's response interact; skill acquisition and consolidation, learning relaxation, cognitive restructuring, coping self-statement, and problem solving; and application and follow through, practicing in increasingly realistic scenarios. SIT has practically strong evidence for PTSD, combat related trauma, anger management, and performance anxiety. If you look at the application section, you can see these three-phase model to understand better. You might want to look at your own practices. So my pen dropped. So SIT would be very helpful if you can apply in your own situation. Again, all the theories we talk require some level of self-awareness, self-examination. Okay, CBD has a lot to offer. CBD has many strengths that could contribute to many multicultural perspectives and some limitations as well. On the strength side, CBT used the client's own belief system and worldview as a starting point for self-exploration. Rather than imposing an external framework, the therapist invites the client to examine their own interpretations from within their own cultural context. The collaborative, transparent psychoeducational structure is accessible and not stigmatizing for many clients from communities where mental health treatment has historically been mistrusted or misunderstood. CBD emphasizes on practical problem solving, skill building, and brief structured interventions that appeals to clients who are seeking concrete help while specific with specific difficulties, including many clients from collectivist or action oriented cultural backgrounds. The behavioral component can be adapted to environmentally and socially focused interventions, acknowledge the client's distress often has real external causes, not only cognitive ones. Now, on the limitations side, the concept of irrational belief can be experienced as disrespectful or dismissive when applied without cultural sensitivity. Think of Aaron Beck's approach, right? How many people would be comfortable when they're confronted, right? What looks irrational for one cultural vintage point may be entirely adaptive from another. A client from a collectivist culture who prioritizes family harmony over personal expression may not benefit from being told their deference is irrational. Their respect to family is irrational. So RBT emphasized on independence and assertiveness may clash with values of interdependence. The rapid fire, finally, highly verbal, confrontational style of classic REBT may alienate clients who value indirect communication, contemplation, or relational warmth or over intellectual debate. So CBT's the present focusedness can also miss how clients' culture and historical past continues to shape present experience, including systemic racism, intergenerational trauma, and the cumulative effects of marginalization. Those are some of the areas that CBT might have limitation. As you see, both Alice and Beck's cognitive therapy represent the most systematic application among the contributions that CBT has been subject for many rigorous empirical testings. You find a lot of research and evidence, clinical trials, randomized clinical trial on CBT. The evidence based on Beck's cognitive therapy for depression, for example, is among the strongest in all the psychotherapy. Hundreds of randomized controlled trials have been confirmed its efficacy across disorders, populations, and settings. The credibility of model grows from its empirical foundation. Four approaches that Alice REBT, Beck's cognitive therapy, Tedeschi's strength-based cognitive therapy, and Donald's CBM have cognitive behavioral modification have demystified the therapy process. They are transparent, educational, and structured in a way that empower clients to understand what is happening and why. They discourage dependence on the therapist and invest clients with the skills to become their own therapist. Homework is a central vehicle for all these approaches, which is learning session should be practiced in life. And a major collective contribution is the emphasis on putting newly acquired insights into action. Insight without behavior change is insufficient. Cognitive insists on the doing, not just the understanding, right? And as a final thought, one of the four approaches that we talked, REBT, CT, SBCBT, and SIT, right? Stress inoculation therapy, which resonates most of you. I want you to think about it. What does your answer reveal about your own therapy of change? Now, if you look at the reflection in the text, if you look at the questions in the text, you might have some meaningful thought to share on this part. So again, this would be more meaningful if you do in class, but I want you to think about it as we conclude this chapter.